No high UNC official met any PDP official.
You don't need the UNC to pass the bill.
This is the worst and they need to go.
Fire burn you, Guardian.
How much more could we tolerate?
You lack the intellect and the competence.
Everywhere else is vaccinating except Trinidad and Tobago.
You cannot pay people money that you owe them.
Good day, everyone, and welcome from the offices of the Honourable Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, Dr. Rudal Munilal, to a lively and educational discussion on the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Act. This discussion will tell you why that legislation is not good for any one of us here in Trinidad and Tobago, why it takes away from the quality of our lives and that of our families and children. This discussion is relevant to everybody in Trinidad and Tobago. We thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you share this broadcast and encourage others to view and to share thoughts on this discussion. We are, as we said, broadcasting from the Member of Parliament office at Oropouche East, that of Dr. Rudal Munilal, who is one of four panelists in this discussion. We have four high-powered, quality panelists who are sectoral leaders in their respective fields, and they'll provide their own perspective. I wish now to introduce panelist Dr. Valmiki Arjun, one of the country's finest economic minds. He's based at the University of the West Indies. He is a regular media commentator on issues of economics, accountability, procurement, and so on. One of the country's fine young minds. I ask you to take in the contribution of Dr. Valmiki Arjun.
From an economic standpoint, procurement usually tends to be the Achilles heel for governments in many developing countries across the world, not just Trinidad and Tobago. Now, establishing high levels of procurement can be significantly beneficial, but not just from a governance standpoint, but also from a fiscal standpoint, from bettering the fiscal institutions of the country, which I'm sure you'll agree is of utmost importance for Trinidad and Tobago in these tumultuous economic times. Now, you see, high procurement standards means greater transparency. And where there is greater transparency, there will be less wastage of public funds. There would be faster completion of government projects. They will be completed at least on time or even faster and at a lower cost. And most importantly, the country, the taxpayers, are going to get value for money whenever the government provides certain services or embark on various projects, like, for example, building new infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, highways, etc. And even engage in certain purchases, like buying supplies for the hospitals. We, in turn, the taxpayer, would get value for money. So overall, better procurement, it really translates into more savings for the country and better value for money.
So can you give an example of the incarnation of this poor procurement process, where it takes place in the sectors?
Yes, certainly. So when the state engages in one of their more important types of expenditure known as capital expenditure, that would involve things like building infrastructure, like hospitals, roads, highways, etc. They tend to award contracts to implement this. These contracts are awarded to various entities to implement these various projects. But given the low levels of transparency brought about by poor procurement, what tends to happen traditionally, and it's not just in Trinidad and Tobago, I want to reiterate that this is in many countries across the world, there are many instances where there's what we call an inefficient allocation of these contracts, whereby the entities that are allocated these contracts to, they may not necessarily be the most deserving entities for these contracts. They may be less productive. They may have overbid on the contract and won the bid. And in addition to that, they could probably take forever to complete this project. By the time it's completed, it would have been many years since its due date. All the while, they would have received these or been awarded the contracts, not due to economic expediency, but more due to political favoritism, when in fact there may be other contractors bidding for the exact same project who may be they may be more efficient, they may be cost effective, and may be in a better position to deliver this project on time or even faster and at a lower cost.
So these poor procurement processes definitely has an effect on the public purse, correct?
Yeah, certainly. Now, it does certainly have a negative effect on the public purse, because apart from overpaying a contractor, well, let's look at the overpaying the contractor first. If there are instances of low transparency due to poor procurement and a contractor is awarded this particular project and he overbids, that means at the end of the day, the government is paying that particular contractor much more than what the project is actually worth. So they're overpaying him. That's more money being spent right there than there ought to be. But if they are also unproductive, then that could delay the completion of the overall project. And when there are delays, there are cost overruns. So for example, if a project is to be completed in about 2 years' time, then, but it actually takes about 5 or 6 years to complete this particular project, naturally the project is going to become more expensive. So for example, the price of construction materials, they tend to go up over time. And there could be instances where some of the contractors may actually over-invoice for the construction materials. Therefore, the government ends up having to pay more for the particular project. In addition to that, remember, they hire workers. The contractors hire workers to obviously do the job. But if it's taking 5 or 6 years as opposed to 2 years, then that extra 3 or 4 years, they're going to have to pay more wages to these workers in order to complete the project because the project is going on for many more years, not so? So the wage bill goes up as well. So there are many avenues by which delaying a particular project can cause the cost of the project to go up quite substantially. Now, who bears the additional cost of this project? It is we, the taxpayer. We are the ones that have to pay the extra money in order to ensure that this project is completed. But there is another cost to the entire economy due to these delays. It actually prevents us from enjoying the economic benefits of these projects had they been completed. So for example, the jobs it could have created, the revenues for the state it could have provided. Let's say, for example, the state wanted to embark on, or they tendered out a project for building infrastructure like roads, highways, improving the transportation network. If completed on time, or within a fairly short space of time, this would have the added benefit of connecting businesses from one part of the country to another. So there's business-to-business connection. There's greater productivity of the workforce because workers, they won't have to spend so much time stuck in traffic. They get to work faster, and that enhances the productivity of the overall company and the workforce.
Traffic is an issue that we face here.
Yes, certainly, right? And it gets worse year after year.
Right, and with poor infrastructure, it's getting worse.
Correct, but it goes more than that, because once there's better infrastructure, businesses can have their raw materials delivered to them quickly or in a fairly short space of time, the goods for resale in a short space of time. They in turn can make their deliveries quickly in a short space of time. And remember, in these times of COVID, we are slowly but surely transitioning into a more digital economy where orders can be placed online, and businesses, especially small companies, may very well find themselves having to make deliveries instead of customers coming to them in a physical location.
And if we don't have the infrastructure,
how can we make this even possible?
I understand.
So all of these, we cannot take it for granted. These are factors. Just by enhancing the transportation infrastructure of a country, it enhances the productivity, it enhances activities in the private sector. You see, part of the issues with procurement, the poor quality procurement bringing about low levels of transparency, is that plain and simply, it facilitates corruption, unethical activities, corruptions, where because of the lack of transparency, contracts could be awarded, but again, for particular reasons whereby a contract is awarded so that a particular government official perhaps, or state level official perhaps gets a kickback or particular or some level of financial gain from awarding the contract. Now, what we have to remember is that these are things that make our corruption perceptions rankings even worse. And we are, as you mentioned before, ranked at 86th position. But when you look at countries like Barbados, they are miles ahead of us. Barbados is on 29th position right now. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that this is yet another significant leakage from the public purse. When monies are lost to corruption, you can't get that money back. Those monies are basically unaccounted for. They're gone. In fact, it's not just about the corruption avenue. When funds are lost because of poor procurement and low transparency, because of the bringing about monies being lost due to the cost overruns, the overbidding, contractors overcharging and overbidding, so monies are also lost there. And of course, with the corruption's argument, when these monies are lost, the government has to find that money elsewhere in order to meet their expenditure obligations. It deprives other sectors in the country that could have made more productive use of these funds. It deprives other avenues in the budget that the government needed to spend money on that could have also made productive use of this money, that could have been used to create new jobs and decrease our poverty levels.
And when this money has been exhausted due to poor procurement, what does the government do?
Well,
how do they get, there's a project that needs to be completed. Where do they allocate money from?
That's actually a very important question. You see, when monies are lost to procurement, the state still has to find the money to meet their other budgetary obligations, their other expenditure obligations. So what is the fastest thing that governments, especially in economies like us, look to do? They borrow the money. Now, because revenue streams are lacking at this point in time, and for quite some time now, we cannot continue to keep borrowing money in such a callous manner. Yes, revenues are wanting, they are lacking, and that's actually quite concerning because it signals that we may not necessarily be earning adequate revenues or sufficient revenues to be able to service this debt, to be able to pay off this debt. Right now, the debt to GDP ratio is in the vicinity of about 83%.
So we understand what is procurement, we have understand the issues, we have understand the effects of poor procurement. Let me ask you one last question. What is one practice that you see that we can use to improve this process?
From a practical standpoint, we have to bring our procurement standards in line with the international standards. And one way we can do this is through the implementation of an electronic procurement platform. So what is that? Simply put, well, first of all, I should add is that it is currently being implemented by a host of economies out there and a host of developing economies out there. It's being implemented in China, in Rwanda, in Kenya, just to name a few countries. Now, the gist is that it automates or it digitizes the entire procurement cycle, which and of course, if it is digitized, then that means it speeds up and it would allow for greater transparency in the procurement process, and that is exactly what we're looking for. We want it to be faster, and if it's faster, the process itself is supposed to be less costly, but it is more transparent. You will have a much better audit trail. So it's going to involve things like electronic sourcing of suppliers, e-tendering, where the state would send out various tenders electronically, e-auctioning, e-ordering, and even e-payments. So even payments could be facilitated online through this electronic portal. So for example, whatever offers or bids that exist for a particular project would be provided on this electronic portal, and of course information on the winning bid would be provided if governments, and we could take it a step further, as other countries have started to do, utilizing blockchain technology in order to help governments and state agencies source supplies whenever they need it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arjun, for that profound contribution. We thank you for your analysis and your insights. We are, as we said, discussing the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Act. We are at the offices of the Honorable Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, Dr. Rudal Munilal. Dr. Valmiki Arjun of the University of the West Indies, we thank him very, very much for his insights. Our next panelist is Kevin Ramnarine, former Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs. In addition to that, one of the region's top finest minds in the hydrocarbon sector. He has been, as you would have read and seen, his contributions throughout the Caribbean and extra-Caribbean. He has been a transformative Minister of Energy, and whatever successes the PNM administration can count in that sector is because of the trailblazing work he has done. Public procurement and disposal of assets are extremely critical to that sector, and it pertains to many things, including the assets at the point of peer. We are very happy to have with us the Honorable Kevin Ramnarai.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our host, the Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, constituents of Oropouche East, ladies and gentlemen of the listening public. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here today to participate in what I consider to be an exercise in our democratic right, which is our right to voice our opinion on government policy and on public policy in general. Corruption is a major issue in developing countries, such as Trinidad and Tobago. It retards growth and diminishes competitiveness. There is an obvious correlation between levels of corruption as measured by the Corruption Perception Index and economic development. The least corrupt countries in the world, according to the CPI, are countries such as New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland, Singapore, Sweden, etc., and not surprisingly among the richest countries in the world. In these countries, there is efficiency of capital expenditure and value for money for government's capital projects. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, public procurement represents more than 1/10 of GDP, of gross domestic product, in high-income countries, including 24% of GDP in Switzerland, 21% in the Netherlands, 18% in Singapore. Governments in developing countries also procure a large share of their expenditures through public procurement. Kenya, for example, procures 26% of its GDP through public procurement. Estimates suggest that between 10% to 25% of the monies governments spend on public procurement ends up in bribery or corruption. This is money that could be spent towards human development, namely educational services and healthcare services. At the heart of corruption in public procurement is the ease of doing business. The more layers of bureaucracy and the more approvals that are needed, the more likely there will be corruption and the incentive for corruption. Put simply, inefficiency benefits someone. In Trinidad and Tobago, our ease of doing business rank is 105th in the world. We are among the lowest in the world. If we make it easier to do business, we reduce the probability of corruption. Corruption is not new to Trinidad and Tobago. We have been grappling with corruption since independence, and well before that. We can in fact go back to the 1940s and the Cora Dam scandal. Our cure for corruption has been the passage of law and the application of the rule of law. But the rule of law is only as good as the efficacy of law. The Republican Constitution of 1976 spoke to the creation of the Integrity Commission. That, however, did not materialize until the late 1980s when the NAR government came into office. We also have on the statute books of Trinidad and Tobago the Prevention of Corruption Act and the Proceeds of Crime Act. These laws, while very important, have not worked to rein in corruption. Trinidad and Tobago is ranked 86th in the world on the Corruption Perception Index, one of the lowest ranks in the CARICOM region. Jamaica is ranked 69th, Barbados 29th, Guyana 83rd, St. Lucia 45th, St. Vincent and the Grenadines 40th, Dominica 48th. Only Suriname is ranked lower than Trinidad and Tobago at 94. Developing countries, however, can look with some hope towards the progress that has been made in countries like Mauritius and Botswana, which have been making great progress to improving their CPI rank. What is obvious is that the laws that have been passed have not stemmed the tide of corruption. What is needed is more probity and related institutional capacity rather than rule-bound compliance. This is what the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act of 2015 offered. I was on the first Joint Select Committee on Procurement in 2010 when the then People's Partnership government assumed office. The work of that committee eventually became the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 1 of 2015, which was recently amended in 2020 to effect, among other things, the removal from the oversight of the Act of government-to-government contracts. The amendment to Section 7 of the Public Procurement Act also exempted the following services provided to public bodies or state enterprises. These are legal services, financial services, accounting services, medical services, and such services which the minister may by order determine. The effect of these amendments is a dilution of the intent of the original act, which was aimed to provide the institutional capacity and the probity required for public expenditure. The exemptions as they relate to state enterprises is of particular concern, as these state enterprises have less oversight mechanisms when compared to government ministries and statutory authorities. This, in my opinion, is a step in the wrong direction. It is a step away from transparency and not towards transparency. High standards in public life can be attained if there are efforts from leaders to promote such standards. It is for this reason that the former People's Partnership government pursued full compliance with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, a goal which we achieved in 2015 and for which we were praised by the then EITI chairperson, Claire Short, who was a former cabinet minister in the Tony Blair cabinet. It goes without saying that if we want to build a more prosperous and just society for all, we need to tackle corruption in all its forms, at the highest levels and at the lowest levels. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act 2015 was a step in the right direction, and it is now unfortunate that the intention of the act has been undermined. Going forward, it will fall on the shoulders of the public, the opposition, the media, and independent public commentators to demand that the level of probity that is needed for all public procurement and for government-to-government contract is ensured so that the interest of the public is served. In summary, Trinidad and Tobago is at a very critical juncture in its history as it relates to public procurement. And we have a golden opportunity to put in place the institutional capacity to oversee all public expenditure. And that capacity should not be diluted or undermined, as has been done by this recent amendment. It is therefore the hope that going forward, that we would move the procurement regulator or the institutional body responsible for oversight of public procurement towards becoming stronger and not becoming weaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kevin Ramnarine, former Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs. We thank you tremendously for your insights. We are, of course, discussing the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Act, an act that is cutting away from the quality of lives of all of our people, because, as our panelists have been explaining, the measures in the critical measures are taking service contracts, and in addition to service contracts, government-to-government contracts and government-to-international companies contracts out of the purview of this important piece of legislation. We thank our panelists, Dr. Valmiki Arjun and Kevin Ramnarine. Dr. Tim Gopi Singh is one of the region's leading statesmen. He was the Minister of Education and another transformative minister in the administration of Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bissessa. He is a renowned surgeon throughout the Caribbean and extra-Caribbean. He has been attached to various local and regional educational institutions. We thank him for being with us, and we look forward to the insights on this critical piece of legislation of Dr. Tim Gopi Singh. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tim Gopi Singh.
I'm pleased to be here this evening at the invitation of the Honorable Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, Dr. Rudal Munilal, to speak on the issue of the amendment to the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Act, which was passed in December 2015, both in the Senate and in the lower house, by a simple majority. You would remember that Mrs. Bissessa, as leader of the opposition, made one of her promises to bring on the procurement legislation as part of the manifesto before 2010. And that became one of the early prioritized cabinet notes, the Procurement Bill 2010, for the 11th Parliament. And this was moved to the House as a bill, and then a joint select committee was formed to deal with that. I was elected by the committee to be the first chairman and then taken over by Dr. Tiwari subsequent to that. We worked assiduously over the first year. Then, to our dismay, both the leader of the opposition, then Dr. Keith Rowley, and now Minister of Finance, Con Imbert, decided to sabotage the entire work of the Joint Select Committee and absented themselves for almost 2 years. It was only when the general public and the Businessmen Association, the Chambers of Commerce, and a number of organizations began to speak with them and to indicate that they must continue to attend the meeting. Then they came back, reluctantly so. And then we were able to continue the work of the committee. We ended in 2015, and that was passed in both houses of Parliament by a constitutional majority. So the Procurement Act became Act number 1 of 2015. And all was left was to continue making the regulations to guide the procurement regulator and the team in terms of procurement subsequently. It was never the intention of the PNM to ever want a procurement act, because they knew what they had been accustomed doing over the number of years. Remember, PNM governed this country out of the 58 years, they governed this country for 42 of the 58 years. And since they started, in the days of Dr. Eric Williams, there were issues related to the lock joint scandal, then the John O'Halloran and Francis Privat issues, and where they had to both migrate to Panama, and they never came back because there was no means of Trinidad and Tobago with a policy of bringing them back to Trinidad for trial. And then was the Tesoro scandal and the Caroni Racing Complex scandal. And then the Soditech construction for the Mount Hope Medical Complex, which was supposed to cost 500 million, cost 1.2 billion, and so on. And then the Hall of Justice cost overrun, and the Twin Towers at Eric Williams, the Eric Williams Twin Towers. So PNM has been steeped in issues of lack of accountability and transparency in terms of procurement practices since independence in 1962, and it still continues today. And they have spent close to almost $1 trillion over the period of time. Trinidad has spent over $1 trillion, most of which have been spent by the PNM government. And within the 11th Parliament and this the 12th Parliament, they have spent more than $300 billion already. Where has there been the transparency and the accountability and the probity in the expenditure of these vast sums of money from Trinidad and Tobago? They don't want procurement, and this is why they delayed the making of the regulations. And now they came back in December of 2020 to try and pass some amendments which really emasculated the entire Procurement Act. And these amendments dealt with the whole issue of public-private sector partnership. They don't want the procurement regulator to look at these. They don't want the procurement regulator to look at government-to-government contracts, nor accounting and auditing procedures and financial procedures of the state and state enterprises, and also things of medical issues and legal issues in terms of procurement. So they emasculated, and as some people said, they gutted the Procurement Act of 2015. So now what has happened since then? They passed it with a simple majority, both in the Senate, where they got one person more than the tie to support them, and in the lower house, well, they have the majority of 22-19. Now, all the business organizations, the National Chambers of Commerce, the Law Association, the Contractors Association, all have exclaimed that this should not be done and this should not have been passed. And so the leader of the opposition, in her wisdom, has decided to ensure that we have thousands of signatures indicating that there should be a repeal of this amendment, which was passed in December 2020 to the Procurement Act. And through this medium, we are asking Her Excellency, the President, not to assent to this bill, which was passed by just a simple majority in December of 2020 last year. Because this is proving to be a whole eradication of the procurement legislation which this country has been asking for a number of years. Just take, for instance, for example, today, one of the newspapers had on its editorial that Caribbean Airlines has lost $738 million for 2020, fiscal year 2020. Caribbean Airlines has lost $728 million. Now, they have also decided that they will continue with the procurement of the MAX 8 aircrafts, just about 12 aircrafts. Now, where is the procurement aspect of this? How has Caribbean Airlines how are they dealing with this procurement issue? They have just decided that they will procure these MAX 8 aircrafts, and there's no procurement regulator that they will have to go to account for this. And so this is just one example. Then the disposal of property, public property, the Petrotrin issue, where more than about $30 billion had been lost over a period of time, with the borrowings of $850 million US and $750 million US over a 9 or 10 year period. That's 1.6 billion US. That's about more than 12 billion. Then the World GTL cost another 3 billion. And then so many other plans that had never materialized with massive expenditure in Petrotrin. And all under the PNM government over a period of 2008, even up to today. And now Petrotrin the whole aspect of divestment of Petrotrin leaves a lot to be desired. So in terms of public sector, private sector partnership, we have now 2,000 homes that are going to be constructed. You think the government is going to make that transparent and accountable to the general population? No, it's another hidden secret. So these are just some of the examples that, and then the government-to-government relationship with the acquisition of the two vessels from Australia. Lots of questions have been asked on it, and there have been no answers forthcoming. Then the question of the medical aspect, who is going to procure the $600 million in pharmaceuticals, how are they being procured? No accountability whatsoever. So the government wants to continue with the lack of accountability from since 1962 to now 58 years later, 42 years of which they govern, and almost $1 trillion have been spent during that time, and over 300 million spent from the 11th Parliament to now the 12th Parliament over these 5.5 years of governance by the PNM. So the question, they obviously want to run away from the whole issue of procurement and don't want the public to understand and have an appreciation of how the public purse is being used to finance government expenditure. So what we need to do now is for all the councillors to support the Member of Parliament in Oropouche East and all the 19 members of Parliament from the opposition to get thousands and thousands of signatures to say that enough is enough. The amendment to the Procurement Act of 2015, the amendment that was passed in December of 2020 must be repealed, and the government must be brought to account to the people, and the Minister of Finance must answer about the expenditure of over 300 billion over the past 5 years. And he borrowed close to about $60 billion over the period of the last 5 years in government. And just before we demitted office, just before we came to an end in the 11th Parliament, he had borrowed another $20 billion to save for COVID. How have they spent this money for COVID? How has the Minister of Social Services, the Minister of Planning, spent the $50 million that was allocated by the international agency and given to them? So these are questions that remain unanswered, and we await the issue of the signatures, and these signatures, which would be in thousands, will be taken to Her Excellency the President, and we ask her to avoid signing and giving assent to this amendment to the 2020 amendment bill, which was passed recently by just a simple majority, whereas the parent legislation was passed with a constitutional majority. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, former Minister of Education, former lecturer and professor, and one of the region's finest medical surgeons, for his insights and his analysis on this flawed piece of legislation. We are broadcasting from the offices of the Honourable Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, Dr. Rudal Munilal, and we are discussing this critical piece of legislation that the United National Congress is calling for its recall for obvious reasons, detailed so far by 3 of our panelists. We lead now to our final speaker and our main panelist, the host Member of Parliament, Dr. Munilal. Dr. Munilal, as you know, was a senior government minister in the administration of Mrs. Prasad Visesa. Dr. Munilal, as you know, was involved in several delivery projects, major delivery projects in the administration of Mrs. Prasad Visesa, and he knows firsthand the importance of public procurement and disposal of public property. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward, just like you, to the contribution of Dr. Rudal Munilal.
Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago. Good evening, viewers, listeners, wherever you may be throughout the world. Tonight, it is our pleasure to speak to you on this issue of procurement, a matter that has bothered our society since 1962. Different administrations have tried over the years to tackle this burning issue. However, it was the partnership administration during the period 2010 to 2015 that took legislation to the Parliament, convened a joint select committee of both opposition and government, and made progress in pioneering procurement legislation and comprehensive procurement legislation. The PNM at that time, we must remember, did all in their power to undermine, to sabotage, to hinder the progress of that joint select committee. It took several years because the members of the then opposition refused to even go to the meetings of the joint select committee. Be that as it may, at the end of our term of government, we did pass legislation. It was left to proclaim, because when you pass legislation, you must give some time for the government and the state entities and so on to put in place the administration, the institutions, the human resources and so on, to give effect to the law. and to give effect to legal entities. The PNM government from 2015 to today, they have consistently and frequently undermined the progress of the implementation of comprehensive procurement legislation. Whether it is that they took 6 years or more to draft procurement regulations pursuant to the Act, whether they took years to appoint persons. In some cases, there are institutions that had to be put in place that they refused to put in place. There are certain, what is called subsidiary legislation that had to be passed, regulations and so on. And it became frustrating. So much so that a former deputy chairman, I believe, or deputy director of the procurement entity resigned in frustration over that matter. So that this government has absolutely no moral authority to speak on procurement. While they accuse members of the now opposition, former government, they accuse us of everything under the sun. They criminalize, vilify, and so on. They have done absolutely nothing to implement the procurement law. Having failed to implement the procurement legislation, comprehensive procurement law passed by the People's Partnership Administration, Keith Rowley and this government then did the unthinkable. They came to the Parliament with one of the most obscene amendments ever seen in the Commonwealth, where they gave blanket exemptions to certain categories of contracts, for example, medical services, legal services, and so on. They gave blanket exemptions so that a government could embark upon multi-million-dollar contracting in specified areas without any reference at all to the procurement administration. And that, we believe, was obscene. We accused the government then and now of butchering the act. So much so that we have carried out a campaign in the opposition where we have received thousands and thousands of support for a petition calling on the government to go to Parliament and remove those obscene amendments and return to the comprehensive law passed by the People's Partnership Administration. In terms of my work over the years, I have personally carried out a particular campaign on behalf of my colleagues in the opposition, with the support of my colleagues, as it relates to the procurement of CCTV cameras for the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. When we were in office, we increased the amount of cameras by, I believe, over 500. We established mobile independent units so that the police and law enforcement can monitor activities as they happen. They can be in touch from the moment that an offense is committed, a crime is committed. We can set in train a particular sequence so that we can quickly pick up the trail of criminal elements and so on. But that means that CCTV cameras must not only be erected, but they must be working. They must be functioning. We discovered 2 years ago that 40% of the CCTV cameras, about 600 cameras to 800 cameras, were not working. Regrettably, when the child, Andrea Barrett, was kidnapped, the cameras in the vicinity of that area were not working and could not help the police to quickly get on the trail of the kidnappers at that moment. This is a scandal of the highest proportion. In September 2019, this government had an open tendering system where they invited bidders to put in a bid to purchase cameras and to operate them. Miraculously, when the deadline came for that bid, within minutes of the deadline, the bid was cancelled. It was cancelled on the instructions of the Ministry of National Security. That, we believe, should be investigated. They cancelled the bid. They gave back open envelopes to the business persons who submitted their bid. So they came and they got their envelope open, which means someone read the bid, someone took note of what is the cost and so on, associated cost of each business person. This happened in September 2019 or thereabout. Lo and behold, we heard in the Parliament, I think even by accident, that in January 2020, a contract was indeed awarded to a Canadian company by the name of Johnson Controls. That company has local affiliates, at least on their website. When we inquired, there's a conspiracy of silence as to how that company got the contract, who was their contact, who are their local agents. That is the type of procurement this government practices. Johnson Controls, who we never heard about before, got a contract to supply cameras to the law enforcement agencies in this country for the tune of over 70 million United States dollars. When we asked questions about that, they want to sue us. But there was absolutely no tendering, no open competitive system, no bidding, but the government procured CCTV cameras. How did they know Johnson Controls? No one knew. Who is their contact? We have in mind someone, he wants to sue everybody. This is the problem we face today. Millions and millions of Trinidad and Tobago dollars are being spent through processes that are not transparent. The government refuses to give disclosure. Just a few days ago, in a joint select committee on national security, of which I'm a member, I asked the permanent secretary in the Ministry of National Security to tell us the process by which that contract was awarded for the CCTV cameras. The permanent secretary, before he could even say one word, the then chairman, Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines, intervened to stop the permanent secretary from answering and told the permanent secretary if he chooses, he don't have to answer now, we can put that answer in writing. Well, 1 month has gone and I'm still waiting for the answer in writing. More than that, Fitzgerald Hines is now the Minister of National Security. So the same person who intervened to stop the permanent secretary from making disclosure on the Parliament record as far as the procurement of CCTV cameras is concerned is now the Minister in charge of the ministry and the de facto boss of that permanent secretary. So do we expect disclosure? Do we expect transparency? Do we expect accountability? I don't. As we call now to repeal the offensive amendments to the procurement legislation, I would like you to recall that Keith Rowley and Stuart Young in particular have developed this habit of traveling all over the world and by themselves, without public officers, without lawyers, without permanent secretaries, without technical officers from ministries. They are traveling, whether it is in Houston, it is in Amsterdam, it is in Australia. They are traveling all over the world conducting the business of procurement. This is wrong. This is possibly unlawful. And when we raise the matter, of course, they vilify us in the Parliament and outside. But they procured boats in the Parliament on record on Hansard. A former official of the Port Authority said that the Minister of Works instructed officers to go to Miami to meet the suppliers of boats and parts and so on, and told them to, quote unquote, beat down the price. This was even before a tendering system was put in place. That by itself speaks of corruption. That speaks of high-handedness and unlawful conduct. They went to England, the Prime Minister said. He went to England buying boat. He met somebody who told him they have boat in Australia. He go down to Australia and buy boat. Over 400 million United States dollars. The same thing with procuring aircrafts and so on. They have made procurement a bad word. They believe that procurement is wrong, that procurement practices and standards are wrong. And they can just go, because they are self-righteous and they can do no wrong, they can go by themselves and procure anything they want. And that is how the taxpayers' dollars have been spent, corrupted away, mismanaged. And that is why today we don't have schools in our community. The children cannot get laptops. That is why today people cannot get houses, they cannot get grants, they cannot get hampers. That is why today the government buy paintings but not laptops. And that is the state of governance in this country. You will hear much more from us in the coming days on these matters, but I implore you to sign our petition, to give support to this crusade to repeal the amendments. Over the past few days, Trinidad and Tobago witness a mini reshuffle of the cabinet because, of course, of the unfortunate passing of former Energy Minister Franklin Khan. But those appointments are extremely curious. Fitzgerald Hines has been a failure in about 8 ministries. We will recall he was Minister of Public Utilities and did not know of a major $240 million deal between TSTT and a telecom company. He was Minister of Works and Transport, I think, for a week. Under Mr. Manning, he was Minister indeed in the Ministry of National Security. Today, Stuart Young has been a failure in national security, and having failed in national security, he now goes to the Ministry of Energy. He has absolutely no experience or training in the energy sector. He has absolutely no background in the technical area of petroleum and so on. His record clearly shows that he is the caddy of Keith Rowley. They have been in Houston where they allegedly negotiate gas prices that led to the collapse of Point Lisas as we know it. They went to Maduro, Venezuela, where they were negotiating a deal called Dragonfield that collapsed before it started. That is their track record. Stuart Young was trying to attract sandals to Tobago, that collapsed as well. All their game changers collapsed. Stuart Young was involved in all. He's now in the Ministry of Energy. He is unqualified and disqualified from being Minister of Energy of Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of Fitzgerald Hines, he is equally disqualified. It is a pity that Keith Rowley could not get talent from outside of his current cabinet so that he could have brought in talented, resourceful people who could make some difference. Mr. Hines has chaired a National Security Committee. It is pathetic. In fact, I put it to the listeners and the viewers this evening that the damage Fitzgerald Hines could do in national security could make COVID-19 look like a jab sting. He is a dangerous man to head that ministry because of his lack of understanding of how government works, proper procedures, and his over PNMite type of approach where he insults, where he's arrogant. So that those appointments are very curious and prone to failure. Keith Rowley apparently has absolutely no more talent to look at outside of the cabinet, and this is why he's trying to, as I said earlier in the week, he's really moving scrap iron from one side of the yard to the other side of the yard. Before we close, I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, former Minister of Energy Kevin Ramnarine, former Minister of Education Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, the University economist Dr. Valmiki Arjun, Mr. Ken Ali for his chairmanship of our very, very progressive meeting. I want to thank all of them. I want to thank the organizers from the Office of the Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, of course our party officials who put this together for you this evening. Thank you all, and we look forward to speaking to you very soon on some of these critical issues. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rudal Munilal, Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, former Minister of Housing, and Minister responsible, as we said before, for urban development also, and for the delivery of major projects. We thank you again very much for joining us today from the offices of the Honourable Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, Dr. Rudal Munilal. We have been discussing the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Act, an extremely flawed piece of legislation. The thrust of this campaign is to get the government to withdraw this and to introduce fresh amendments to the legislation to protect all taxpayers and to protect our use of public funds. We thank our panelists. We urge you now to keep the battle running on this matter, to discuss the issues among your peers, in the media, and in organizations to which you belong. We thank you very much for being in our audience.
No high UNC official met any PDP official?
You don't need the UNC to pass the bill.
This is the worst and they need to go.
Fire burn you, Guardian.
How much more could we tolerate?
You lack the intellect and the competence.
Everywhere else is vaccinating except Trinidad and Tobago.
You cannot pay people money that you owe them.